In order to decipher what makes us human, it's critical to first understand where we come from. What milestones occurred that led to the development of Homo sapiens sapiens? What were the important events that had to occur for the first forms of life to even emerge? There are many milestones that had to take place in order to shape our species into the biped creatures that we are today. Here, we're going to begin our story long before we became human, long before the first primates walked the earth, or before the first vertebrates roamed the lands, and even before the earth came into existence. The story of us begins 13.8 billion years ago, when a point of infinite density and gravity exploded. We recognize this explosion as the Big Bang. This video will cover the milestones in human evolution that occurred during the first 10 billion years of all of our universe. From when the singularity exploded, to when the Earth formed, and to when some of the chemical compositions found on the early Earth finally became life. The Big Bang is the first milestone in human evolution. This is an event of when the universe came into existence. The universe began as a tiny single point, only a few millimeters wide. This point was compressed with infinite density and hot energy. And 13.8 billion years ago, this point violently detonated. What caused the singularity to explode remains a mystery. But within the first second, this explosion sent shockwaves of super hot energy through the interstellar medium, causing the fabric of space to rapidly begin expanding, stretching, and fluctuating in all directions with unrestrained energy. This impactful chaos was the cosmos being born. The universe now had come into existence, and with it, particles such as neutrons, protons, and electrons also materialized. These are the raw materials that would, in due course, become every single thing that exists today. As the temperature of the universe slowly began to cool, the simplest and lightest elements were born. Hydrogen coalesced into the first stars, which eventually produced heavier elements through the process of fusion, until many of them exploded as supernovas that scattered their cosmic guts throughout the universe, forming future nebulas and stars like our Sun. This gave the universe an opportunity for other objects in the solar system to form. At approximately 4.5 billion years ago, gravity was able to pull together the swirling gas and the interstellar dust particles that had been left from the initial explosion. This gravitational influence caused the dusty disk of matter in the solar system to accumulate into clumps. As per the laws of physics, the largest and heaviest objects in the still-forming solar system became the Sun, while the smaller objects surrounding the Sun became the planets, the Moon, and the asteroids. The gravitational influence also had an effect on how the elements were separated and how they eventually settled into their appropriate place. The heavier elements, like the metals, were drawn closer to the Sun, while the lighter elements, such as the gases, orbited furthest away from the Sun. Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars are the denser planets because they're made up of materials called silicate, which is a rock that surrounds an iron core. Their high density is why they are situated closest to the Sun. Conversely, the outer planets in our solar system are furthest away from the Sun, since they're mainly made up of gases such as helium and hydrogen. Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune are the largest planets, but they also have the lowest densities. Their low density is the reason why they orbit the outer parts of our solar system. The Earth, now formed into a rocky terrestrial planet, had a solid crust, a rocky mantle, and a central core. However, for billions of years, the early Earth was nothing like the Earth you see now. From space, our planet would have looked like a radiating ball of lava. It was a scorching wasteland covered in magmatic oceans and toxic fumes that hovered over its surface from non-stop spewing volcanoes. This Earth was continuously bombarded with treacherous asteroids, space debris, and other matter material. It was exposed to hazardous solar radiation. It contained low levels of molecular oxygen and radioactive decay. The early Earth was a hostile globe of molten rock with no water, no atmosphere, and no life. This period, dating between 4.6 and 4 billion years ago, is informally known as the Hadean Eon, which was a name modeled after the mythological Greek god Hades, who was the god of the dead and king of the underworld. Hades fully controlled and ruled the underworld and everything in it. His world, with volcanic lakes and the constant looming of death, resembled the early Earth with its orange-brown skies, uninhabitable magmatic surface, and ferocious volcanic activity in every direction. One important event that occurred during the Hadean Eon was the Theia impact. This is when a protoplanet approximately the size of Mars collided with a developing Earth around 4.5 billion years ago. This massive crash generated enough heat to create oceans of magma on Earth. This head-on collision obliterated a huge portion of Theia and Earth and ejected a humongous piece of cosmic dust, molten iron, and other debris into orbit. From orbit, this metallic hailstorm lasted years, if not centuries, but eventually, with the influence of gravity, this cloud of rolling chaos coalesced back into a solid structure. This solid structure became the Earth's moon. Theia's remains can be found deep within the Earth's mantle and on the Earth's moon. Before the Theia impact occurred, the Earth had been a dynamic and unstable planet that was spinning at a much faster rate than today. However, this powerful collision caused the Earth to slow down. It created stable weather patterns and the Earth to tilt on its axis. Ultimately, the Theia impact gave rise to the Earth's moon, but it also created seasonal changes that became fundamental in the eventual formation of ecosystems, biomes, and organism adaptations. It is hypothesized that around 4.4 billion years ago, water-rich planetesimals such as icy comets and meteorites crashed into Earth. These aqueous objects most likely traveled from areas beyond the Sun's frost line. Specifically, the asteroids would have come from an area between Mars and Jupiter, which is far away from the blazing solar flares that would otherwise have vaporized the frozen water within these planetesimals. These celestial bodies crashed into Earth and added water and an atmosphere. Some researchers disagree with this hypothesis and instead argue that water on Earth had always been locked in the rocks that originally formed the planet. Rocks in the Earth's layer called the mantle have been studied, and scientists have found large amounts of hydrogen and oxygen bound up in minerals. These minerals can be liberated in particular circumstances, such as when volcanic outgassing, which is when molten rock rises to the top, spewing gases to the atmosphere in the form of water vapor, nitrogen, and hydrogen. It is thought that as the Earth's surface cooled enough to where water could remain in a liquid state, the steam caused by possibly volcanic outgassing condensed into the clouds, into rain, and into the water vapor that eventually filled the Earth's oceans, lakes, and rivers. It's possible that both of these hypotheses are correct. Water could have been present within the building blocks of our young Earth. But comets and asteroids may have also delivered part of the water that is now found on this blue planet. Regardless on how the Earth acquired its water, once water and an atmosphere was established, the environmental conditions on the Hadean Earth became less hostile. The early, inhospitable planet transformed into a primordial soup of organic opportunity that in due time inevitably emanated the first signs of life. There are various hypotheses on how life originated, and many of them are based on the idea proposed by Charles Darwin in 1971. Darwin was actually reluctant to publish his views on how life began, but in a letter written to a colleague, Darwin wrote that the first molecules of life could have formed in a warm little pond. This warm little pond is now referred to as the primordial soup. Some scientists believe that around 3.7 billion years ago, deep-sea hydrothermal vents created the ideal conditions for the first life forms to emerge, rather than in shallow ponds. Hydrothermal vents are spectacular, deep ocean features that are located in areas that have underwater volcanic activity. These structures have intricate pillars that are covered in small chambers. Particle-laden fluids emanate through these chambers as hot as 752 degrees Fahrenheit or 400 degrees Celsius. There are various types of hydrothermal vents, but our attention will be focused on those called white smokers. White smokers work similarly to the hydrothermal vents called black smokers. They're just not as hot, and they primarily spew a concoction of minerals made up of barium, calcium, and silicon. This makes the plumes lighter in color. The bubbling fluid that ejects out of these chimneys is between 402 to 572 degrees Fahrenheit or 206 to 300 degrees Celsius. The plumes are heated when seawater seeps through fissures located deep within the ocean floor and come into contact with red-hot molten rock. In this region, below the mantle's crust, the water picks up a cocktail of chemicals such as acidic fluids and dissolved metals. This makes the water high in alkaline and now capable of generating chemical reactions. The fact that all this activity probably occurred deep beneath the surface of the Earth also means that any organic material would have been protected from harmful solar radiation that bombarded the early Earth and from other geological upheavals that were present during this time. The combination of alkaline water, heat, and pressure created enough energy to move the mineral-rich water from below the mantle's crust and through the vents until it gushed into the surrounding deep, cold ocean water. This powerful source of energy was essential in breaking down inorganic material that could then be converted into complex organic molecules, since the energy from the sun alone was unable to provide enough power to perform this task. But these hydrothermal vents did have the energy to create the chemical reactions needed to form compounds based on simple elements like hydrogen, carbon, and nitrogen. The scorching hot, mineral-rich plumes that poured out of these chimneys mixed with the surrounding water on the ocean floor and formed a unique cauldron where hydrogen and carbon dioxide were able to react and bond. The chemical reactions that occurred on the early planet near white smoker hydrothermal vents likely created spontaneous formations of various types of complex molecules called amino acids. These amino acids combined to form nucleic acids, lipids, and proteins. This is an important process since proteins were likely used as cell membranes or as structural support inside cells. In other words, the first forms of life likely derived when simple elements like carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, and oxygen bonded together in various combinations and in specific sequences that then assembled into small molecules called monomers. These small molecules further combined chemically with other molecules to form large chain-like structures called polymers. Some of these polymers are known as enzymes, sugars, proteins, RNA, and DNA. These polymers happen to be made up of the basic building blocks of all life on Earth. In recent studies, small molecules, which are the building blocks of proteins and primitive cell membranes, have been shown to form spontaneously and consistently near alkaline hydrothermal vents, making it likely that white smokers played an instrumental role in the development of cell-based life. But having the building blocks for life available in a primordial soup was not the only factor that was needed for life to emerge. Another important invention had to materialize. Self-replicating molecules able to compete with other entities had to first come into existence. The first replicators were likely simple RNA molecules that were able to store information like DNA, but were also capable of creating chemical reactions like proteins. And because RNA was capable of storing energy and creating chemical reactions, DNA and proteins were likely not necessary for the formation of the first forms of life. Most scientists believe that life was formed in an RNA world, absent of proteins and DNA. In fact, DNA is now known to have evolved at a much later time than RNA and can be regarded as a modern modified version of RNA, even though it remains unclear how precisely DNA evolved from RNA. But in terms on how the RNA molecule evolved, it's likely that during the early Earth, some RNA building blocks called nucleotides near white smoke or hydrothermal vents happened to have had an affinity to bond with other nucleotides. Whenever these nucleotides came in contact with each other, they would bond together. This bond means that the first RNAs would have been created. However, at first, their bonds would have been unstable, and as a result, many would have degraded quickly. But soon after, new bonds would have once again formed in their place. In some instances, some nucleotide bonds would turn out to be stronger and more stable than others. Natural selection would have favored the more stable strands of nucleotides that could grow longer and quicker. Over time, when they got to the point of growing faster than they could degrade, RNAs finally had the opportunity to begin life. The exact chemical steps that transformed simple molecules into the first biological life forms remain unclear. However, what is well understood is that the earliest chemical and physical conditions of the early Earth are interwoven with the emergence of the first living organisms that spontaneously emerged around 3.5 to 3.8 billion years ago. It took RNAs millions of years of tinkering, multiplying, and evolving before these RNA molecules were able to take hold. Soon after the RNA world had been established, the first organisms that could be considered life emerged. These first biological single cells were simple. They likely consisted of organic molecules such as a self-replicating RNA molecule surrounded by a lipid membrane. They were primitive, microscopic, underdeveloped organisms called prokaryotes. Prokaryotes means before or without a nucleus. So, as the name implies, these first life forms did not have a nucleus. They also lacked organelles that were surrounded by membrane structures. This means that their RNA chromosomes were scattered throughout the cell instead of being organized in pockets like more complex cells that later evolved. Prokaryotes were small, simple, and able to move with the help of a tail called a flagellum. They were capable of reproducing asexually and rapidly through binary fission, which is a method of dividing by separating into two new bodies. They would duplicate their genetic material so that each new body would inherit an exact copy of the genetic code. Ultimately, these cells were the first organisms with the basic traits needed for life. At around 3.5 to 3.8 billion years ago, prokaryotes were the only living organisms on the planet, and they lived alone for about 1/3 of the existence of all life. These seemingly innocuous microbial organisms were simple, but this doesn't mean that they were boring. Prokaryotes were not stagnant or passive organisms simply floating around in some pond by any means. They were dynamic and constantly evolving and adapting to their surroundings for 1.5 billion years. They evolved into many interesting shapes, sizes, and colors. Some prokaryotes had a cell wall that was made up of protein and sugar rings, while other prokaryotes, such as Archaea, did not have a cell wall or a defined nucleus. The physical characteristics of prokaryotes depended on what they were adapted for. However, they were all adapted to living in extreme environments, such as living in scorching hot or very cold temperatures that contain low levels of oxygen. With varying levels of success, some could withstand high levels of radiation and pressure or environments that contained high concentrations of salt. Such adaptations must have evolved in these early life forms because such environments were likely present on the early Earth. After many years of evolving and adapting in various interesting ways, a special group of prokaryotic bacteria called Cyanobacteria became evolutionarily optimized to convert light energy that they captured from the sun into fuel by way of photosynthesis. This was an important adaptation for this group of bacteria since they could now utilize the energy produced by sunlight to make their own food rather than depending on chemicals produced by hydrothermal vents for food. There are different kinds of photosynthesis that some prokaryotes were able to perform, but the important type for our purposes is the kind that produced oxygen as waste. Oxygen waste is a byproduct of photosynthesis, and cyanobacteria were the first organisms able to produce oxygen as waste. This production of oxygen by a staggering number of cyanobacteria covering large portions of the Earth eventually transformed the oxygen-deprived early Earth into one with lots of oxygen. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It took about 500 million years for the entire planet to eventually become oxygen-rich enough to cause an event called the Oxygen Catastrophe. This event is thought of as a catastrophe because the high oxygen concentrations emitted into the atmosphere caused the Earth to rust. Iron rocks eventually oxidized. This influx of oxygen created an environment that was toxic for most of the organisms living on Earth during this time since they were all adapted to living in a low or absent oxygen environments. These bacteria are known as anaerobes. The oxygen catastrophe nearly wiped all organisms out of existence, but it also created an opportunity for other bacteria, like Archaea, to thrive. Archaea were capable of withstanding extreme, harsh, and chemically aggressive environmental conditions such as acid lakes or living in the deep ocean's scorching hot hydrothermal vents. Although Archaea could only survive in low or nearly absent oxygen environments, the hydrothermal vents became the perfect sanctuary for these resilient but anaerobic organisms to flourish. After the oxygen catastrophe event, the oxygen-producing cyanobacteria started taking over the Earth since a vast majority of competing microbes were killed off. Their way of living, making a living through photosynthesis, was more efficient, and this allowed them to create extra energy that could later be invested in cellular specialization. This was an important invention for the later development of complex living organisms. A cluster of specialized cells became tissues that later became organs that later became systems, and before you know it, complex little creatures of various shapes and sizes with limbs were swimming or walking around the Earth. However, before any complex organisms could develop, 8 billion years had to pass before the Earth's atmosphere reached high enough levels of oxygen to sustain complex forms of life. But the important takeaway is that cyanobacteria were the engineers responsible for the crucial environmental changes that occurred on the early Earth. They transformed the anoxic world into one that's oxygen-rich, a world that is capable of sustaining life. This transformation by cyanobacteria ultimately set the stage for all the remarkable forms of life that later evolved. At around 2.7 billion years ago, the next milestone in human evolution is marked by the emergence of complex single-cell organisms called eukaryotes. Eukaryotic cells evolved from ancient prokaryotic communities by forming a chimera through symbiosis between archaea and bacteria. A symbiotic relationship is a living arrangement between two organisms of different species. The relationship is not always positive, but in the case of the emergence of eukaryotic cells, it was. This mutually beneficial relationship between archaea and bacteria developed over many generations and in entirely separate instances. Some bacteria called Proteobacteria and Cyanobacteria took up residence inside an archaea cell after being engulfed. The absorbed cells began living harmoniously as cellular organelles inside its host. And for the first time in the history of life, an organism was now capable of becoming a larger, more complex cell than the simpler unicellular organisms before it. As a result, the emergence of eukaryotic cells made it possible for the enormous diversity of organisms that later evolved. But how exactly did eukaryotic cells form? As mentioned earlier, a wide range of prokaryotic cells had been in existence for about 1.5 billion years prior to the emergence of eukaryotic cells. Some prokaryotes were bigger than others, and some had more complex features, such as having an infolding of their cell membranes, or they had a simple membrane surrounding their DNA. The point is that there were a large variety of prokaryotic cells in existence. The larger prokaryotes were the Archaea bacteria. These cells had the ability to fully engulf other cells. They did this to obtain energy. Some of these engulfed prokaryotes were digested and used as energy, but some bacteria couldn't be digested and instead became a part of the cell by living inside of it as an organelle. In some instances, some smaller free-living bacteria would actually try to enter other larger cells to prey on them or to parasitize them. In many insects today, such as in aphids, specialized fat cells called bacteriocytes exist inside their intestines. Bacteria and fungi live inside these intestinal cells and provide essential nutrients such as amino acids to the host. But at the same time, the bacteria and the fungi profit by being protected by the host cell. They have an endosymbiotic arrangement, and outside of this relationship, these insects or these microbes would not survive. They are now fully dependent on each other for survival. A process similar to this likely occurred in the evolutionary past with some single-cell organisms that lived on the early Earth. The evolution of endosymbiosis began as a chance event. Larger Archaean gobbled up other cells to extract energy by way of digestion in order to survive. However, some prokaryotes could not be digested, such as in the case of certain prokaryotic cells called Proteobacteria, or in the case of Cyanobacteria. Proteobacteria are able to use oxygen to break down carbon compounds, which they convert into chemical energy called ATP. Once engulfed by an archaea cell, Proteobacteria produced energy for its host, while Cyanobacteria continued to produce food that also benefited the host. Through these organelles, Archaea had essentially hijacked the ability to photosynthesize and to produce its own food. However, this relationship with Archaea was not one-sided. Archaea provided protection to the organelles from predators since they were now living in an encapsulated environment. They were all living harmoniously in symbiosis. However, this endosymbiotic relationship did not occur all at once. It took many generations for this relationship to develop, and it occurred in two separate chains of development. The first endosymbiotic relationship with Archaea developed with Proteobacteria, and at a later time it happened again with Cyanobacteria. Over numerous years, the organelles stopped behaving as independent organisms. They became more specialized until they fully became little ATP and solar-powered sugar factories for its host cell. As a side note, around 1.45 billion years ago, Proteobacteria had evolved into the mitochondria that we recognize today. And the microbes, able to create their own food by using energy from sunlight, which are cyanobacteria, evolved into chloroplasts around 2 billion years ago. After Archaea developed a symbiotic relationship with prokaryotic cells, a giant eukaryotic cell emerged. This new cell now had a defined nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. This made it more efficient and better at surviving in the environment. As a result, eukaryotes gained a significant edge over other cells by way of natural selection, and in a relatively short time from an evolutionary perspective, they became abundant on Earth. Unicellularity is clearly a successful strategy for surviving in a multitude of environments, and their reign over the Earth for over 2 billion years prior to the emergence of other life forms clearly demonstrates the high caliber selection for self-preservation. These single-cell organisms continued to evolve and became the ancestors to all multicellular life that later emerged. The eukaryotic cells that contained both mitochondria and chloroplasts eventually evolved into plant cells, while the eukaryotic cells that only contain mitochondria evolved into the fungi cells and animal cells. Ultimately, as super unicellular organisms, the emergence of eukaryotic cells marked a pivotal moment in the history of biology and a major milestone in the eventual origins of human evolution. From a point of dense energy with enormous gravity that exploded to form the cosmos with everything in it, to the later formation of a young hostile Earth that eventually equilibrated itself into the perfect home for the very first living organisms to ever exist. The milestones covered in this video mark the first in a series that became important in the eventual emergence of the biped creatures that now roam the Earth. But the story told here is just the beginning, given the enormity of the timescale that we're dealing with. Next time, we'll continue exploring the succeeding milestones that contributed to the origins of our species, which in turn will guide our understanding of what makes Homo sapiens sapiens human.